welcome to the Center for the Humanities event for this evening. My name is Hugh Thomas. I'm the director for the center, and I'll say just a couple words before turning it over to the main event. First, I want to apologize for the email fiasco yesterday, which we saw unfolding before our eyes and were, despite frantic efforts, unable to stop, but we've been working with IT all day to make sure this never happens again. So once again, apologies. On a brighter note, I just want to say something about our next event, which is a book talk by Dr. David Kling, who is the Chair of Religious Studies. That will be Wednesday, March 24th at 8 p.m. And he'll be talking about his book, A History of Christian Conversion. I'd now like to turn the podium, so to speak, over to my colleague, Professor Pamela Geller. We'll be talking a little bit about the exhibit before we have the introduction to our main speaker. So Pamela, take it away, as they say.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen so I can show some images of hostile terrain. Good evening. I am Pamela Geller, an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Miami, and I would like to welcome you to the opening of two companion art installations, Hostile Terrain 94 and Separated. To kick off this exhibit, we are fortunate to have Chantel Acevita and Sally Hughes moderate a conversation with the wonderful author Valeria Luiselli, who Chantel will introduce properly in a few minutes. But first, some background information about the exhibit. Hostile Terrain 94 is a participatory art project conceived of and organized by the Undocumented Migration Project, a nonprofit research, art, education, media collective that is directed by the anthropologist Jason DeLeon. I and my co-curators, Brenna Monroe, an associate professor of English, and Roxanne Pickens, director of the Learning Commons, were more than happy to bring this endeavor to the University of Miami, one of 150 host institutions. The project's name evokes several things about the humanitarian crisis at the US-Mexico border. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement was enacted, which fueled migration from Mexico to the US. Not coincidentally, that same year, the US government implemented its policy of prevention through deterrence, or PTD. The deterrent being the extremely treacherous environment of the Sonoran Desert. Since the 1990s, undocumented migrants fleeing poverty, violence, and corruption have been funneled through this hostile terrain. A migrant body count is how the US government measures the efficacy of PTD. As of 2019, over 3,200 individuals have perished from exposure, hypothermia, hanging, suicide, gunshots. Hostile Terrain 94 shines a light on deaths only describable as bad ones. As an act of memorialization, participants have inked basic forensic information onto 3,200 toe tags. Manila tags represent identified or named individuals, while orange signifies those who are unidentified. These tags have then been geolocated on a wall map showing the exact locations where a decedent's human remains were found. A screen flanking the exhibit displays students' reflections on the act of filling out toe tags. Inspired by the reflective and participatory elements of Hostile Terrain 94, Separated is a collaborative tribute to the children who have yet to be reunited with their families. As part of the Trump administration's zero tolerance policy, family separation functioned as a nefarious type of prevention through deterrence. It was Roxanne who suggested we craft chains of paper dolls from vellum, 628 for the number of unreunited children as of December, and then accent them with gold leaf to highlight the fragility and preciousness of these children. Situated in the center are 7 dolls that honor the children who died while in the custody of US Customs and Border Protection. A special thank you to Jay Silvestre for decorating these dolls with the national birds of Guatemala and El Salvador, the countries from where they came. Turning our attention to children in this current moment seems especially necessary. The number of unaccompanied migrant children detained at the border has surged in recent days, and news reports indicate that the Biden administration may reopen the for-profit child detention center in our own backyard, the Homestead Temporary Shelter for Unaccompanied Children, which was closed in 2019 after much public outcry. Hostile Terrain 94 and Separated are located on the first floor of Richter Library and will be on display until May 31st. Unfortunately, they are only open to the University of Miami community. As per COVID-19 protocols, appointments will be required. The reservation link is now live on the library's website, and I believe it's in the chat as well. Now, some thank yous. Because of the pandemic, this exhibit has been a long time in the making. It would not have been possible without the Undocumented Migration Project team, as well as the many students, faculty, staff, and family members who filled out toe tags, crafted paper dolls, and diligently pinned all of these materials to the walls of Richter Library. Deserving special attention are Allison Shafani, Chrissy Arce, Magdalena Bosrak Jackson, Hannah Artman, Khadija Moody, Mary Jimenez, Kaylee Pickard, Nick Tricarico, and Daniela Rodriguez. I would also like to offer a show of gratitude for the co-sponsors of these exhibits. University of Miami sponsors for Hostile Terrain 94 include the Department of Anthropology, Department of English, the Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas, the Latin American Study Program, the Butler Center, and the libraries. And for Separated, we are grateful for support from the Learning Commons and Zuleta Arts LLC. And a final thank you to UM Center for Humanities for organizing tonight's event, and in anticipation of the conversation that will now occur, to Valeria, Chantel, and Sally for extending our understanding about migration, policy, memory, and craft.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this very special evening. My name is Chantal Acevedo. I'm a professor in the Department of English and director of the Creative Writing Program. And I'll be joined today by Sally Hughes, the Associate Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, and Global Initiatives out of the School of Communication, as well as our honored guest, Valeria Luiselli. I'm so happy that we're going to get a chance to speak with Valeria Luiselli today. She's a celebrated author. Her body of work is significant and varied, and I know that I am personally a big fan. It includes the essay collection Sidewalks, the novels Faces in the Crowd, and The Story of My Teeth. Her most recent books are Tell Me How It Ends, an essay and 40 questions, and The Lost Children Archive, another novel. Her work explores characters who find themselves at significant intersections in their lives. Issues of immigration, dislocation, and loss are common themes in Ms. Luiselli's oeuvre, and she approaches the books with structures that are innovative, form illuminating function, and vice versa. The Lost Children Archive, her latest book, was described by NPR as being, quote, a remarkable feat of empathy and intellectuality that once again showcases Luiselli's ability to braid the political, historical, and personal while explicitly addressing the challenges of figuring out how to tell the very story she's telling. Pertinent to the conversations we are having on campus now, inspired by the Hostile Terrain exhibit, Luiselli's two most recent books take on the issues of immigration, and specifically that of child refugees. Braiding journalism and fiction, Luiselli presents readers with stories about real crises facing children at the border, stories which, as all great books do, humanize the reader in the end. Valeria Luiselli was born in Mexico City and grew up in South Korea, South Africa, and India. She's been awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim, and an American Book Award. She has twice been nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Kirkus Prize, and has been a National Book Foundation 5 under 35 honoree and recipient of a Bearing Witness Fellowship from the Art for Justice Fund. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Granta, and other publications, and has been translated into more than 20 languages. She lives in New York City, and we are very glad to have her with us in this virtual space tonight. We're going to have a conversation with Valeria Luiselli, and while we are chatting, I encourage you to please leave your questions in the Ask a Question portion of the Zoom chat. There should be a button for you. And Meg is also leaving us some notes on that as well. So the first question is going to be Sally's, and so Sally.
Thanks, Chantal, and thank you, Dr. Luiselli, or Valeria, as a professor here at the university and someone who considers Mexico her segunda patria. I'm delighted that you could join us. So the emotional pain that so many Americans experienced when hearing the audio recorded cries of children separated from their parents by our government remains proximate and visceral, but the 1994 deterrence policy is beyond the living memory of most of our students, and it's a distant memory to many of us who remember only sporadically reported news about the deaths in the desert. Given that public communications have difficulty sustaining memory, outrage, and public demand for a more humane immigration policy, I really wanted to get your reflections on current policy, on the communication of memory, and how you envision the impact of your work. So in these last weeks, nearly 100 days, we've seen some important actions to elevate human rights as an element of US immigration policy during President Biden's first 100 days. Just yesterday here in South Florida, tens of thousands of Venezuelans could breathe a little easier because they received stronger protections from deportation back to a country that is going through a horrendous humanitarian crisis. But there's also been pushbacks to these initiatives, such as local ICE office noncompliance with orders to halt deportation. And as Dr. Geller mentioned, the possibility that a for-profit child detention center would open just 10 miles south of our campus. So given that, what is your sense about how much US public opinion and the Biden administration are willing to do, and are able to do to implement lasting change, especially when you consider the cyclical nature of our immigration policy? I think,
Sorry.
there you
I'm
are.
glad you told me.
Sure.
I was saying, first of all, thank you for these complex and important questions, Abby, and for your warm introduction, Chantal. I'd like to begin where you finished, cyclical nature of migration patterns, and connected to that, the cyclical nature of political violence for particular communities in the US, right? If we think of the latter, policies that remove, silence, and make invisible populations that are not seen as belonging to the collective imaginary of the United States have always been exiled and removed and placed aside, right? Beyond it relating to migration or not, right? So the very foundation of this country's modus operandi with those populations is in removal and making visible. So if we think the Indian Removal Act and the ensuing Trail of Tears and the deportation of Native American nations into spaces that were difficult to inhabit, to say the least. Then think later and simultaneously of course, the industry of slavery and the following segregation laws and the following mass incarceration of African Americans, again, as a modus operandi, as a way of making sure that certain populations simply don't partake in this nation's everyday life. Then migration looks kind of different, and the way that migration is, it becomes part of a larger, or we can understand it as part of a large system of operation. And migration, I think, it's really important to understand that it is not a problem. It will never be. It will always be an internal reality to a country, especially a country like the United States had so much dealings with, to put it lightly, so much interventionism as a foreign policy in other nations, so much so that the very social fabric of those nations has become undone, is still not recovered, I'm thinking right now particularly of interventions in the USA in Central America in the 70s. But this, of course, is a pattern that goes way beyond our hemispheric migration route, the one we're talking about. But just to focus on this, I mean, it's this migration now is still a result of American foreign policies in the 70s. I think that an important switch in terms of historical memory is really, really important, right? The argument in favor of treating migration or dealing with migration, understanding migration framework of human rights is not a question of empathy, of being able to feel for others. You can't rely necessarily on people's empathy. It is a question of historical responsibility. The historical responsibility of a nation that has had dealings with interventions in other nations, and therefore intricately connected to those nations, right? So I think that is really, like, that discourse is to change. And yes, you're right, the media outlets, the newspapers, radio, the day-to-day of news easily forgets, and we easily forget it as well. But it's definitely necessary and important, but it's one layers of the conversation upon which I think that writers build through fiction, through nonfiction, but also playwrights, but also dancers, but also visual artists. I mean, there is, in order to change a foundational myth, foundational narrative about what a nation is, a lot of people from a lot of different angles have to chipping away at old imaginary and contributing to imagining a new foundational myth, right? In which, the people, in which, for example, I mean, just something very simple, in which Hispanics, for example, are not foreigners to the land. I suppose it's definitely different, I know, in Florida because of the presence of the Hispanic world, but in the East Coast, it's harder for others to understand. In the northern East Coast, harder for others to understand. Very simple, plain fact about this country, which is that it is also a Hispanic nation and was from the beginning of this version of the nation state. It's not the beginning. And that this is a Spanish-speaking country, the second largest in the world, right after Mexico, larger than Spain and larger than Colombia and Argentina in terms of sheer numbers. And yet, Hispanics always have a kind of foreignness attached to them, as does Spanish. And it seems like it's a foreign reality. It's not a foreign reality. It's just like a voluntary ignorance of that very present reality. So yeah, I mean, I believe in the power of narrative, and I don't refer only to what is written and what is told. Narrative as a kind of greater kind of fabric that that threads our discourses, threads our senses of belonging, and that serves as a space for us to also disagree, right? But it needs to be there, and I believe in the necessity of us slowly but very vehemently transforming that narrative, right?
Locating your work in a foundational, or to contrast a foundational racial project that's so intertwined with the foundation and historical development of this country, I think highlights even more just how difficult it's going to be to make lasting change. And I'm struck also by how you mentioned empathy is only a layer that we need to not only evoke empathy, but I would say educate and change even essential values that become so ingrained in our everyday behaviors and ways of thinking. The participatory art projects that are in our library, your work, some documentary journalism, they do have the potential to convey lasting memory, to convey history, to encourage learning. But they require a lot more work on the part of the person who's reading or watching them. Especially today, you know, a tweet barrage or the daily news is so much more easily accessible. To watch a documentary, to read a novel, we have to invest time, we have to do emotions work, we have to be in a position where we have the knowledge and networks to know these exist. So, you know, as creators, as educators, how do we help break through the daily noise?
That's a very hard question, because it's a question about enthusiasm in a deeper way, right? Like, one can really only engage with difficult work if one feels enthusiasm for it, right? Or if one's obliged to, because you're taking a course or something and you have to pass the midterms. But even then, like, you don't really engage in a deep way unless you find a connection. And I think that it's very easy to feel disconnected when you still don't kind of know like the deeper layers of history, where maybe you are presented with a monumental problem, like this is happening at the border, and that's it, you know, and then but you don't know anything else. It's really hard to see like where you can pull a thread and start understanding and connecting. And I think it has a lot to do with, you mentioned education, and I think it does have a lot to do with the way that education, and especially the education of like his history in this country, is thought of. I didn't study here, so what I say comes more from what my students express to me. I teach college students, so a lot of them are kind of coming straight out of high school, and my impression, having taught at several different institutions and even just given a lot of talks throughout the country, that there is a kind of silencing of, like a convenient silencing of a lot of bits and pieces of US history, right? So when I ask my students like what they know about the Mexican-American War, for example, most of them, except maybe the ones who grew up in Texas, who say something like, yeah, something about El Alamo, but then something else. But most of them are like, I don't know. Not their fault, you know. I think that's a structural problem. That's something that's being decided and or omitted generation after generation, to not look in that direction, right? And think like just a deeper commitment, like a national commitment to a more thorough understanding of history, but then also a larger commitment to gazing outside the US, and a commitment to understanding the world in a less insular way is really important, you know. I think that like a lot of, for example, the identity debates that are going on, have been going for years here, I think a lot of them are quite myopic, that they don't see anything outside the US, how identity functions in other places and how it shifts, and how there's so many other discourses, and we are in this is a huge country with an enormous like engine for cultural production of knowledge and scientific discovery. So of course it's kind of easy to not look outside, right? It's kind of easy. There's so many movies, new Netflix series, new presidential tweets to read it. Like it's all it's a noisy place, and in a very exciting way too, you know. But for those of us who didn't grow up here, I think I've been here for a long time, but I didn't grow up here, and I know that I grew up with, and I think a lot of Latin Americans would say this, with like one eye placed in my country and in our like national space and identity, and one eye always kind of looking outward, you know, like looking toward Europe, looking toward the US, looking towards other centers of power and how they see us, you know, like there's always, you're very conscious of like, of how one is seen from outside, how one is seen from within, how do you look at how your own perception, like identity perception of yourself is informed by other cultural perspectives. And it's not that consciousness, the shift of consciousness needs to, I think, happen here, you know. There needs to be less polarity.
Right. I've seen this in my own students. They sometimes come to us without having been exposed to the history, for example, of racial prejudice against Latinos, especially since we're in Miami, and it's a different pathway for the majority Latino populations here. So some of my students are somewhat shocked to learn about the history of racial discrimination against Latinos and the present of, obviously, of racial discrimination. So thinking about structure, thinking about global comparison, I think those are really important observations, but it's difficult because it's ingrained even in high school textbooks. I've seen studies of what is taught and how it is taught. So it takes a lot of attention. Just finally, before turning it over to Chantal, you know, there's a lot of ways to gauge impact. Here we're often encouraged to measure it, sorry, not engage, but measure impact. We're often encouraged to measure it numerically. You could also measure it in other ways, through policy, through reflection. How do you try to gauge the impact of your work? What sort of impacts are you hoping for? Do you write with a sense of duty, and what is that?
You know, it's impossible to write from that space, and it's probably not recommendable, I would say, because you can't carry the weight of expectation and internalize expectations and then produce freely. Like you really do have to, when you're engaged in creative work, you are in dialogue with a community, and you're in dialogue with your present, or with your present and past. You're not disconnected. You're not there just in a self-serving way, but you cannot be thinking of impact. It's just too heavy. It's just too burdensome. But then there's impact more or less once something is circulating in the world, once a book is out. And that impact is also pretty, in a beautiful way, I think, not ever predictable. So I remember, like, when I wrote Tell Me How It Ends, I had one particular audience in mind, which is rare for me because I never have a particular audience in mind at all. But this book was kind of different because I was writing it with a kind of clear sense of purpose, and that was to denounce the Obama administration's policies in respect, particularly to the diaspora of children. And I wanted to denounce it because no one seemed to care at that point. It had passed in the news and it was no longer in any headline, and no one was talking about it. And it was Obama, and we all loved him. He was charismatic, so no one really talked about this. I mean, except for the people that have been in that fight all their lives, right? So I was frustrated with that, with the amnesia of it, with the voluntary ignorance of it, and I wanted to write a book that would bring this back to the table as a conversation that was not over, that could not be over. So that was what I had in mind, and that's kind of what happened. But it wasn't really because of the book. It was just because also the Trump administration followed. Then a lot more people cared about what was happening, because the Trump administration was really good about doing like self-publicity of their horror and their cruelty. So more people were paying attention and more people were involved somehow, right? And what I could not predict is the kind of encounters I had with people that read that and that ended up reading that book. So, I mean, there were, of course, young readers who maybe, I don't know, who came from a very conservative family and who come to me after reading and say, you know, this book was really important because I forced my parents to read it after I had to read it in class. And I had really, really good conversation with them, and they were able to understand this other perspective. And maybe they're still going to vote Republican, but, you know, they maybe have a different perspective than they had before. And then there were students in a completely different situation that would come to me and say, you know, in my family, our migration story, my parents' migration story is a taboo. You know, they don't have to talk about it. That is the case in some families. And some families are very open, even like tell the story with sense of humor, and, you know, I don't know, criticize the relatives that have already tried 5 times to cross and they're still not making it. And I mean, there's every family is a world, right? There's different spirits, but in family, this is a traumatic experience, and one that involves a lot of shame and silencing, because no matter how long some of those people may have been here, some parents, some grandparents may have been here, they are still called by society, the New York Times, by everyone, illegal immigrants or illegal aliens. So that becomes internalized, and a lot of people live in shame and don't talk even to their kids, maybe American-born kids, about that. And so anyway, a lot of students came to me to tell me how that book helped them open a conversation about something that their parents never want to talk about, right? And a completely different, like completely unexpected impact, as you say, but I don't know if it's quite impact or what it is. This book was also widely read in Mexico. And I once gave, one of my favorite events I've ever done was in Oaxaca, in southern Mexico, for the maestros normalistas. And those are the teachers that teach in rural communities in the state of Oaxaca. I mean, in Chiapas too, but I was with the Oaxacan normalistas, who came to a reading in a large group of professors, teachers, rural teachers, to listen and discuss this book, because they had all read it and they had all been discussing it. And they were particularly interested in thinking ways in which rural Oaxaca could also change the discourse around Central American immigration through Mexico on their way to the United States, because Central American migrants face as much discrimination in Mexico as they do in the USA. The dangers are less like institutional forms of violence as they are here, less about detention and ice boxes, but still the dangers are horrific, right? I mean, being kidnapped by cartels, to being abused by police officers, to being disappeared. Like it's a very dangerous country for Central American migrants. So anyway, I realized that book could have an impact in a space in which I was like, I was not thinking about that when I wrote it. I was just angry with the US government and with the Mexican government, but not thinking about those spaces. And that is a beautiful thing with all kinds of, every book has the capacity to circulate in spaces in which it never thought it would. And that is a beautiful thing.
I think both those examples are how your work motivated people, as you said earlier, to engage in conversations and even long-term normative change in families or in rural communities. And that's, I guess, ultimately the way we will change things. Let me turn it to Chantal, and thank you for your conversation with me.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Sally.
I'd like to speak really more specifically about the book, the last two books, Tell Me How It Ends and The Lost Children Archive. And the conversation has sort of naturally gone that way anyway. Can you talk to us a little bit about your work with undocumented children? What were perhaps some specific challenges in telling those stories? Of course, one is nonfiction, one is fiction, but what were some challenges in sort of translating those stories onto the page?
Yeah, before I answer though, there's a little coda to Sally's last question, which I think might bring us to what you're asking me. You were asking Sally as well about impact, and you're asking about stories. And one thing that I think is really important, that a lot of us who write also teach, because in this later stage of capitalism, one cannot survive with only one job, or usually cannot. So we write, we teach, and anyway, so one thing that I know how to do is or I've learned how to do is to teach writing. And so one thing that I began doing in 2018, then stopped, and definitely have not during the pandemic, was teacher writing workshop inside a detention center here in New York, in upstate New York. And although teaching in that detention space was in many ways frustrating, among other things because we were constantly surveilled and it was not really possible to create a space of complete freedom for the girls that we were teaching these workshops to just embrace them and write from a place of, I don't know, of feeling not so vulnerable. But aside from all the frustrations, there was one thing that kept me going, and that I think is really important for educators to think about, and especially those people who have the capacity to teach bilingually and maybe go into detention center spaces to teach literature or creative writing. And that is that, you know, this generation, this diaspora of children and teenagers is one day going to be adult. And if right now and in this period, especially when they are held in detention, they are given the resources, the tools, as we were when we were younger, to be able to write and tell stories and know that the worth of telling stories, then among the thousands of those children who have passed through this nightmare of detention systems here, there will be some who are able to write this story, right? Or there'll be film directors or singers or public speakers or poets, and they will be able to tell the story of this diaspora. I guess the final story of this diaspora, right? So that's, I think, another, like, a big sense of impact that I think I have and I can have when teaching rather than writing. And I think in the meantime, what I think is, like, in the meantime, we will be writing these books that generation, when they're adults, can maybe look at and refute and say, yeah, it wasn't so like that, or yes, like this, or yes, that's exactly what whatever it is. But at least we're building a kind of archive, right? Like a like narrative layer upon which others can build, the way that archive works, basically, right? It's very hard to build in the vacuum. You build on top of what's been there before, and then I think that is important to keep in mind, knowing that one book won't change things, two books won't, but they will form a very important archive for those future generations, looking and trying to understand what the hell happened to them in this period. And about the story, Chantal, the challenges are many. The challenges of teaching in a detention center, I've referred to a little bit. And then then they're not dissimilar to some of the challenges of telling stories, which have a lot to do with very practical things, like disclosing someone's identity, or how to protect that person's identity, but still being able to narrate a story that others understand, but that will not in any way damage the person whose story is being told, right? Because when a person's immigration case is pending, they are in the most vulnerable situation ever, right? So everything that you say about them you have to make sure that it cannot be traced back to that person by any authority that might then punish them for what it, right? Because everything's at the discretion of officers and judges, and you have to make sure that you protect. And then I guess, I think that's probably what I found to be the greatest challenge. And then another very deep challenge is like how to not tell a story that will simply be read as, oh, how heartbreaking. Oh, okay, next thing, right? But how to tell a story that is emotionally compelling, but that compels us beyond heartbreak and empathy, and then like feeling good because we can feel empathy for someone, but that actually compels us to engage more deeply the political work ahead, right? And that balance is a hard one, right? It's easy, I think, it's easy to tell a story of a person's horrifying experience, but it's not easy to distill, right? To distill parts of the story and then make sure that that person is also not being portrayed as just a victim. And on the contrary, that you are upholding and honoring the dignity of that person, but beyond the dignity, that's again the political complexity of a person, the complexity of the identity of a person, not reducing that person to just their migration story. Also other things that make us people, right? The music that they like, the situations with friends, like a lot of things that get erased when we tell stories of migration, because people in migration stories, at least when they're happening in front of us, get easily reduced just migrant to just refugee, and everything else gets kind of blurred out. And it's important, I think, not to do that.
Yeah, thank you. I could just ask you questions all night, but I'm going to ask you one more, and then I think we're going to turn to the Q&A. I wanted to ask, you had mentioned it before, how when you were writing Tell Me How It Ends, it was during the Obama era, and the crisis at the border was sort of a blip in the news and then it was gone, right? And so you were writing in many ways in a kind of isolation about this issue, right? As opposed to the next book, which is written during the Trump administration, and suddenly the spotlight is on this issue in a big way. And I was just wondering how that was different for you, or was it different for you as a writer to sort of have this pressure, right? Knowing that there's an audience whose ears are suddenly tuned to an issue, whereas it wasn't before.
A little bit, not so much, because first I wrote the bulk of Lost Children Archive still in the Obama administration, but more importantly for me, I was writing Children Archive while working in court, and had to stop writing it because I felt that I couldn't think about anything than what I was witnessing in court while translating for testimonies for kids. So I mean, for those here tonight that don't necessarily know this, in 2015 I worked as a translator, interpreter translator in immigration court, volunteer court, but for volunteer organizations, translating testimonies from children from Spanish into English so that lawyers working for those organizations could represent them. So we basically do an intake questionnaire, translate that into English, and then a lawyer decide if they take on the case or not, and then defend that kid from deportation. And it was really important to do a lot of these interviews and very quickly, because the Obama administration had changed the policy so that kids only had 21 days to find a lawyer to defend them, as opposed to the 365 days they used to have before. So which really gets to find a lawyer in 21 days hard. So anyway, that's the work I was doing. And I was trying to write Lost Children Archive, and then had to stop because I was obsessively thinking about the work in court, and then kind of trying to use Lost Children Archive as a space to dump a lot of what I was thinking, feeling, witnessing in court. And it was just turning into a big old mess, the novel. But also I realized that I couldn't, through a novel, denounce what I was seeing so well, so clearly. And I had a kind of urgency to denounce something that wasn't going to end maybe anytime soon, but was happening right then and there. And a novel has a different kind of different time, different. And so anyway, for those reasons and others, I decided to stop writing the novel, and then I wrote Tell Me How It Ends. And then I was able to return to the novel without feeling that novel had to be a political instrument or a means to end, right? Without instrumentalizing fiction. And that gave me a lot of freedom. And I don't think Lost Children Archive is a novel about immigration crisis. I think it's a novel with an immigration crisis, and it's a novel that speaks about the cycles of historical cycles of political violence in the USA, from the Indian Removal Act to removal today, and it's about layers of history and how we talk about them. It isn't a timely novel, as some people said. Unfortunately, it's timely. It's like that will probably always be timely. Hopefully not, but I didn't have a kind of political expectation to speak on particular political circumstance.
Wonderful, thank you. So let's try to answer some of the questions that have come in. I think Sally's picked one out for us.
Yeah, actually, I want to summarize two because they're on similar. They have a similar background. They both sort of look at the ideological narrative that's being deployed to promote the current asylum system, right? So Atha, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, notes that American policy is aggressively promoting a system where those seeking asylum should be self-dependent and not becoming a public burden on the US social system. However, most refugees are coming to the US from a situation of poverty and violence, which is then compounded along the way. Is it not counterproductive to increase the immigration quota, but not offer the necessary services that asylum seekers need? Or she goes further and says, could it be that this is actually a way to present immigration policy as liberal, but essentially limit it to those who are in a position to be more productive? In other words, to hire skilled, higher income earning asylum seekers. Sadie also notes that this morning in the news, they were discussing children who arrived in the US alone, and noted that Biden administration would not be sending them back, and questioned whether the US, left the question open whether the US has the resources to care for these 3,000 children. She notes that that seems false to me. How would you respond to this statement or this underlying logic in the news accounts that the US does not have the resources to respond humanely to the arrival of 3,000 children? So both sort of touch on this idea that that the asylum system should be self-sustaining, that the US cannot afford to take in refugees. Do you have thoughts about that you could share with us?
Well, one immediate thought is like a lot of taxes, and yet those taxes go in large numbers to funding a carceral system that is unnecessary to the degree that it exists, a detention system that is completely unnecessary for immigrants who are seeking asylum. Some very expensive things there, but also to wage wars against countries, produce arms and more arms and more arms, instead of giving Americans real public education, real medical services, free public medical services. So, it's, I think, not a question about resources, because this is a with a lot of resources. It's a question about the distribution of resources and the federal distribution of our taxpayer money. So I find that, that building arms is maybe more of a burden to the Americans, what it costs them versus what they could be gaining in terms of medicine and education, than migrants seeking asylum, who will probably come here, absolutely vastest majority of them come here to seek work and be citizens that integrate themselves into a very demanding consumer society, because there's no other way to really survive here. You can't survive on welfare here. This is not Sweden, So yeah, I burdens, well, let's ask where the greater burden is, and ask where our taxpayer money is going to, and think where our fight really is.
And of course, what these people could actually contribute to our society if they're given the resources and the safety to thrive. We have plenty of examples of that here in the Miami area. I don't know, Chantal, did you want to read another question? Or?
Sure. I wanted to read a question that Annika asked. It takes us off sort of in a little bit of another direction, but when you think about the safety of children, you think naturally of the safety of their parents, and I think this speaks to that. Annika asks, do you have any thoughts on how people in the US can support the feminist movement in Mexico, especially given the violent reaction of the country's government? And then I appreciate your work. And I was thinking, of course, that yesterday was the International Day of the Woman. And I thought that might be a good question to tackle.
Yeah, 8M, 8M, 8th of March is a very moving day, very, it's not a day of celebration in Mexico, it's not a day in which one as a woman can really hear the words Happy Women's Day. It's kind of not right, doesn't have that meaning in Mexico. It's especially from some years from a few years ago until now, been a day which a very, very powerful feminist movement is reminded of like the importance of continuing the work that a lot of women are doing and continue the fight. Mexico is a country in which 11 women get killed per day. Every 4 minutes, a Mexican woman is raped. And it's a country in which there is a degree of impunity for rape and femicide between 95 to 98%. So there is a very, very deep structural problem in Mexico with respect to violence against women. I think how can people in the US support? I think the best way to begin supporting is to understand the different forms of feminism, the different discourses. We're not in the same spaces of feminist struggle, although there's a lot of intersections between the struggles here and there. And I would say, first thought is read the work of Latin American feminists. If it's not available in English translation, push for translations. Acquainted with the movement, colectivas, the collectives of women doing really, really great work, both at the level of street and also institutionalized. And before anything can be done, we have to do a lot of self-education. I don't know you particularly, Annika. Maybe you know a lot about this already, but I'm answering more general. You know, what can people do? First of all, self-educate on the similarities and differences. And if you're not opposed, Sally and Chantal, just because the question was brought up, and if I'm allowed to share screen, I would love to share a song that's become a kind of anthem. I would play it on YouTube. It's become an anthem of the feminist movement in Mexico. There's two versions of it. One of them has a video that's really not great, but it has lyrics in English, subtitles. And the other one has the real video of just this beautiful pair called El Palomar, and the singer, the wonderful Mexican singer, Vivir Quintana. But that one doesn't have English subtitles. So what do you think the viewers and participants here might prefer? The original song without subtitles, or the one with subtitles that's not so cool?
Gosh, that's a hard question. I think, why don't we, well, I'll let you choose and then drop the other one.
Hugh was saying the original.
People are saying, okay, maybe.
Let's go with the
I think if people are interested in the song, then they can go and look for the one with the lyrics. And okay, so let me just get it. And I think I have to be sure that I'm allowed to share a screen, but
you should be able to.
Yeah. 2 seconds.
I didn't realize
Okay, there's going to be the ad for now.
how many mistakes I was making in English until I started to use Grammarly.
It's like having a proof reader and an English.
Thank you, Grammarly. Okay, got it. Okay, share screen. All right, give me a second. You can see my screen.
That's amazing. That was amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And hopefully we can find a way to get the link to everyone too, so that they can see it and share it as well.
Yeah, sure. It's just Vivir Quintana. You look for, put in a chat.
My internet says it's unstable, but if you can hear me, we had perhaps one closing question. Can you hear me?
We can hear
Yep.
you.
Okay. It's from a student, Jill. She says, and tell me how it ends. You explain how you began working with migrants as a translator. What advice would you give to students interested in working with migrants and refugees? Further, what do you think is the best way